So welcome to the session with our very special guest, Jocelyn Davis. And for this session, I just want to do a little, before I hand over to Jocelyn, I just want to share a few things. So if you're not speaking, I would love to ask you to mute yourself. And we will be recording this session. So I would appreciate if you don't want to be in the recording, just put your camera off. And last but not the least, if you are on spatial chat, try to mute your browser on the spatial chat so that you don't have an echo in this space of the Zoom session. Okay. So, and with that, I would love to welcome our special guest, author of top best-selling books and a workplace climate creator herself, who's going to share us some wisdom on how to become a workplace climate creator. So over to you, Jocelyn. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Ria. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jocelyn Davis, and as Ria said, my topic today is how to be a workplace climate creator. Originally, I just put how to be a climate creator, but then I realized that often today people think that's about, climate or climate change, and no, we're talking about workplace climate. And I talk about this concept in my book, The Art of Quiet Influence. Here it is. The Art of Quiet Influence, which combines Eastern thought, classic Eastern thought, with how to lead without authority. So that's the topic of the book. And climate is one of the many things I talk about in that book. And I want to get started by telling a story taken from The Art of Quiet Influence. And it's a story about a guy named Cedric. So here it is. In May 2016, I went to London for a week on a book promotion tour. I stayed at a hotel called the Montcalm at the Brewery. It lacked an in-house restaurant, but served a full English breakfast in the back room of a pub just down the street. Being a big fan of eggs, sausage, and mushrooms, I ate there every morning. The breakfast room had a pleasant atmosphere. The floors and tables were clean, the food trays hot. The wait staff, an ethnically diverse group, were all young. They bustled about and had a polite good morning for every guest. The first few days, my tea and toast were brought to me by a young man named Cedric, who clearly knew the ropes. He worked the spacious room with calm efficiency. He had strawberry blonde hair and couldn't have been more than 22. On the fourth morning, there was a new waiter who looked to be a little older than the norm, perhaps late 20s, tall and bearded. The room was crowded that day, the staff more harried, and the new guy seemed flustered as he tried to keep up with tea and coffee and clearing of dishes. At one point, he approached Cedric and asked a question I didn't quite catch. Cedric replied, "No, go fill up the orange juice." They both turned in opposite directions, getting on with a busy shift. But then Cedric turned back and said, not loudly or with any special emphasis, just in a friendly way, "You're doing a great job." The new guy was standing right in front of my table, so in that split second, I saw his reaction. His face, which had been tense, relaxed into a smile. His shoulders also relaxed. He stood a little taller. And off he went to fill up the orange juice with, it seemed, a lighter heart. What's more, I felt lighthearted. The piped-in music had been annoying a moment ago. Suddenly, it was enjoyable. I looked around the crowded room and found it a charming place, filled with interesting people. I thought, it's going to be a great day. I don't remember how long that feeling lasted, probably just a few minutes. But I do know this. I am never going to forget Cedric, waiter at the Montcalm at the Brewery breakfast buffet. He was clearly not a supervisor. He was equally clearly a climate creator. Okay, so let's look a little bit more deeply at this idea of workplace climate. I discuss this concept, as I said, in all of my books. And it's actually one of the most studied yet least understood business concepts. And at my former company, we did a lot of research on workplace climate and how it is shaped and who shapes it. So what is climate? Climate is people's perceptions of the workplace, or more simply, what it feels like to work in a place. It's not the same as culture. So what's the difference? Climate is malleable and can change very quickly, while culture is the underlying values and the unwritten rules of an organization. And culture is very durable and very slow to change. Some people say that it's set in concrete. And it often dates from the founding of an organization. Often culture is set from right from the beginning by the founders and how the organization is set up. But climate can change in a matter of weeks or even hours. Mm-hmm. And again, climate is just what it feels like to work in a group, a team, or an organization. Climate has been shown to affect motivation, performance, and financial results. And it's most strongly affected in turn by the daily actions of people in the organization, especially managers, but everybody else as well. So it's not shaped by anonymous forces like organizational history or strategy or systems. It's shaped by people. And today there's always been a lot of talk about company culture, but company climate or organizational climate is really the more powerful tool for improving results, research suggests. Now, for a very long time, my fellow consultants and I have argued that workplace climate can be managed and should be managed. And we've talked about 6 dimensions of climate that allow it to be managed. And these 6 dimensions are clarity, standards, commitment, responsibility, support, and recognition. So that's what research says, is those 6 dimensions, and you can manage climate that way. But recently, my study of Eastern thinkers, I have a master's degree in Eastern classics, that is the philosophy and literature of India, China, and Japan. And in that study, especially of the Taoists, that has led me to believe that we Western consultants, if you will, have been mistaken about climate in 2 different ways. The first way that we were mistaken is that managing is really not what you do with climate. There's a book called the Zhuangzi, which is by it's the work of a sage, a Chinese sage, very ancient, whose name was also Zhuangzi, and his work is called the Zhuangzi. And in that book, he tells us about a man named Tian, who roamed along the sunny slopes of Mount Yin until he came across a nameless man on the bank of a river. And he asked the nameless man, "How is the world to be managed?" And the nameless man said, "Away with you, you boor! What a dreary question." And I think that's very apt when it comes to climate, because talking about managing climate takes a very simple, sunny topic and turns it into something that's very complex and kind of grim. And my former company, we used to pitch to our services on climate, our climate assessments and so on. We used to pitch to our clients using a lot of charts and data, trying to make the case for climate as a key performance indicator. And our clients never really bought it, to be honest. It never really worked. I think it's because they knew that climate was soft stuff. And I think it would have been better if we had just owned its essential softness and unmanageability, while still emphasizing its great power to shape results in an organization. So it's soft, but it's very powerful. Those 6 dimensions that I mentioned earlier, clarity, standards, commitment, et cetera, I think they're useful in helping us see what a positive climate would look like. So for example, in a positive climate, employees would be committed to the mission of the organization. But when it comes to actually influencing climate, it's not at all inspiring to go around saying, okay, I'm going to manage your commitment now, Ria. Or, hey, Ria, how can I do a better job of managing your commitment? That's just, that's not going to work. So if we're not going to do that, if we're not going to try to manage climate, how are we going to influence it? You know the old saying, be the change you want to see. And that applies to climate as much as to change. Climate creators set an example of clarity, standards, commitment, responsibility, support, and recognition. But even that view strikes me as a bit too complicated. I think that Zhuangzi would laugh at those 6 dimensions and sort of at our efforts to organize the world into file folders. And he would recommend, I think, a much simpler practice. And this is the practice that I talk about in this chapter of my book. Exude appreciation and good cheer. Exude appreciation and good cheer. So rather than trying to manage a climate into positivity, we should just be positive about the work, about our colleagues, about ourselves, about our customers, and let climate follow as it naturally will. Okay, so mistake number 1 was thinking that climate could be managed in this kind of technocratic way. And the second mistake that we made as consultants was to see managers as solely responsible for climate. When we conducted our research in the 1980s and long after that, we were mainly concerned with comparing macro forces like strategy and history with the daily influence of managers. And I don't think it even occurred to us to look at the daily influence of everybody in the organization. I mean, we were in the management training industry. And so there was a natural bias to look at what people in managerial roles did and to assume that managers of some type, whether, at some level, whether high up or low down, were responsible for most workplace phenomena. And we were pretty excited to discover that it was immediate supervisors and not the C-suite, not the executives or the company founders who had the greatest impact on workplace climate. And we shared the good news in our management training courses. We said, hey, guess what? You can manage climate. You supervisors, you're the ones who are affecting climate, and here's how you can make it better. But if I were to conduct climate research today, I would look instead at the impact of employees versus managers, or the rank and file versus leaders. And I would also look at companies with flat or self-managed structures, so Teal organizations. And I would try to see how climate evolves in those environments. And I would still expect to see that supervisors, that is people with hiring and firing authority, I think they probably still have the greatest impact, or considerable impact anyway, on workplace climate. But I would also expect to find that individual contributors of all types, no matter how fleeting their interactions or how supposedly low down in the hierarchy their role is, I think we would find that they can be climate creators too. If you think back to Cedric, the waiter in my story, he wasn't a manager, but he was a climate creator for sure. At a talk that I gave a few years back, I shared that story, and a participant came up to me afterwards, and she said, well, Cedric, he sounds cool, but he wasn't really a leader, was he? And I had this whole conversation where I was trying to sort of argue with her about, said, yeah, Cedric was a leader. But I think that question speaks to a misconception about leadership, and especially leadership in today's flatter or teal organizations. People assume that leaders, first of all, that they have a hierarchical position. And they also assume that leaders always set out with an intention to make change happen, to be a strategist or to be an innovator. And climate creators don't necessarily do that. But the changes that they create are in many ways more profound, more inspiring, and more helpful to results than sort of the official intentional leaders. I want to share one more story, and this is about employee retention and climate's effect on retention. Climate is extremely powerful when it comes to whether people stay or go. So I'm going to share one more story on that topic, and then we can open it up for questions and comments. So this is a story from October 1989, when I had just joined my former company way back. Since Monday, I had been fantasizing about quitting. My employer of nearly 1 week was the Forum Corporation, a medium-sized corporate training company. My job was to copy, edit, and produce materials, workbooks, instructor guides, and other bits and pieces for their sales and management seminars. I sat in a small cubicle farm with several other editors, all of us clicking away on IBM 286 desktops. My 2 previous jobs had been at publishing houses where most everyone had been a task-focused introvert like me. Here at Forum, the culture was different. People beamed and said, "Hey, how are you?" as they passed in the corridors. Shouts of laughter came from the office adjacent to the editing cubicles. Meetings began with icebreakers. And moreover, the entire enterprise seemed to me questionable. Teaching people how to sell and manage, was that even a thing? I felt thoroughly out of place and had decided to stay only until I could find another job in the publishing industry, and I already had a few applications out. It was now 4 p.m. on Thursday, and I was editing some handouts when my boss, Mona, appeared in my doorway toting an enormous rubber-banded roll of Mylar flip charts. This was before PowerPoint. And for visual aids, the class instructors, our classroom instructors, used large pre-printed pads of flip charts. An editor would compile these 50+ charts needed for a workshop, print them out on the laser printer, send the sheaf to a calligrapher. The calligrapher would hand scribe the words and graphics in black ink onto these translucent plastic sheets the size of area rugs. And a roll of these so-called Mylars would come back for proofreading. And then the Mylars were shipped off to the printer, and eventually you'd get a bound set of flip charts for the instructor to use. The whole process took about 2 weeks, which from today's perspective seems insanely time-consuming. It had, however, a kind of artisanal charm. Mona, my boss, put the roll of Mylars on my desk. "Christine just sent these over," she said. "It's a rush. Can you proof them now?" Our day ended at 5:30 p.m., and I've never been good at pivoting. I looked at the foot-thick log and then up at Mona. "I can't. I'm doing these handouts." Mona said, "We really need to get the corrections back to her the first thing tomorrow." I had an inspiration. "Could I take them home and do them this evening?" "Of course," said Mona. "Thanks." She turned to leave, and then she turned back. "Just one thing. Be careful when you take them home, because..." The next few seconds changed everything. There are many reasons I stayed with Forum for 23 years, but had Mona not said what she said instead of what I expected her to say, I might not have stuck around long enough to give all those other reasons a chance. What I expected her to say was, "Be careful because those Mylars are expensive." That's the sort of thing managers at my previous jobs would have said. They weren't mean people, they were perfectly pleasant, but as managers, they were naturally concerned with costs to the firm, and I assumed Mona had the same concerns. I was just about to assure her that yes, I'd be very careful not to damage the expensive flip charts, when she finished her sentence. Because those Mylars have sharp edges. It's easy to cut yourself, she said. In his Everyday Leadership TED Talk, Drew Dudley describes the time when, as a university orientation week coordinator, he gave a lollipop and a friendly smile to a young woman standing in line to register for her first year. Unbeknown to him, she was terrified by the whole scene and had decided university wasn't for her. She was just about to walk out the door when Dudley's small gesture changed her mind. She told him the story 4 years later at her graduation. The odd thing, he says, is that he doesn't remember the lollipop moment. And I bet Mona doesn't remember the flip chart moment either. To me, though, it made all the difference. It told me that this was a place where the first order of business was to care. And it instantly created a climate that made me feel welcome, at home, and eager to stay. So that's those are my stories. And let's open it up, Ria, for questions or discussion. Unmute, Ria.
My apologies. Yeah. So yeah, I am very much moved by your story, Jocelyn, because indeed we in the transformation space, we talk a lot every single day about culture, about how are we setting up our culture, what kind of culture are we trying to shape this organization. But climate, as you have indicated, are the small drips of hydration that your company actually needs to kind of go into the next go into the next days, and it does help with retention. As I was reflecting on your story, I was like, okay, this is very interesting. And in the world of Teal, right? In the world of Teal, we always talk about wholeness, which was kind of in your story where you said Cedric wasn't a manager, but he showed up.
Yeah.
And he showed up with his whole self, and people felt it, I think.
Yeah, and he, the thing that was so impressive to me, this is why I emphasized that whole staff there at the Montcalm was very young. You know, they were all just these young people, very diverse from, all different backgrounds, walks of life. And yet the place, I could tell as soon as I walked in that, and this is something we also found in our climate research decades ago, is that customers or guests or visitors can tell almost immediately, within minutes, whether a place has a positive or a negative climate. And when I walked into that breakfast room every morning, I could sense that there was a kind of a lightness, a sense of happiness, good cheer. So that was impressive. And then the fact that Cedric was, he clearly was not a manager. I mean, he wasn't in that hierarchical role, but he took it upon himself to say to the new guy, "You're doing a great job." How many of us do that, or how many of us think to do that when we are, somebody's peer, when we're not a manager, when we're not, responsible for people's performance? How often do we think to to just say, to give them a casual, you're doing a great job, thank you. I really like how you said XYZ in the meeting, or just these very small things that make such a difference to not only to individuals' performance, but to the financial results of the organization, and things like retention and productivity, and all these hard measures are greatly affected by this very small drip, as you said, the hydration. I like that image.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well, while you were speaking, there was really like a visual that came to my mind, like, you know, that small drop that kind of creates the ripple in the water.
Hmm.
That's how you gauge that little climate activator, right? Within the organization,
Yes.
how you create influence. Um, yeah, I was wondering, so you talked about the two mistakes, right? Where managing is not what you do with climate. You
Mhm.
cannot, you just cannot manage that. I mean, it's too volatile,
Mhm.
sometimes even unpredictable, but it shows up. And the second one is that managers are not responsible. How do you see these two playing out in more flatter organizations versus the more traditional organizations in your studies?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I say, I do think that if you have if you have hiring and firing authority, if you have the authority to bring people into the organization or let them go, then which is traditionally a manager's role, part of a manager's role, um, then I believe that still you are going to have more impact on climate. It's not that it's your job to manage climate. Again, I think manage is just the wrong word, but you will have the opportunity really to make a tremendous impact on climate. But in flatter organizations or teal organizations that don't have that kind of hierarchy, or where perhaps hiring decisions are made by a team,
Mhm.
um, or and decisions, performance evaluations are done by your peers. When that when the ability to affect how people come and go or move within an organization shifts to become more diffuse, then the power, in a good way, the opportunity to create climate is going to become more diffuse as well. And that's why I say, I think, I don't think it occurred to us back in the 1980s to look at, the impact of people other than managers. But we were just interested to see that, because up until that time, people had talked a lot about culture, and it was all, it was that, well, how do we affect the culture? Because this place has this culture and it's so hard to change. And, culture eats strategy for breakfast, as
Mhm.
Peter Drucker famously said. And all that is true. So that, culture makes an enormous difference. But the good news is that climate makes an even bigger difference. And it is something that is affected by immediate supervisors, immediate managers, and I believe today by all of us, by everybody, every single person in an organization is a climate creator.
Thank you. Thank you, Jocelyn. I just want to welcome Alia. Thanks for joining us in this conversation. We're a small group, so if you have any questions for Jocelyn, please feel free to unmute yourself and let's just have a conversation here. Um, yeah, I mean, before I ask my questions, because I have quite a few, Kate has a question about influencing decision makers in the organization to look at climate. How successful are we in bringing this to the surface? I guess not a lot of organizations do look at it, or maybe have the awareness about climate and culture, which Brooke also alluded to.
Yes, it's really unfortunate. I think that this research, which was done beginning in the 80s into the 90s by our organization and by many others as well. There's if you search on organizational climate or workplace climate, then there are quite a few books that will come up. Another book where I talk about it is in my first book, which I co-wrote, and it's called Strategic Speed. So in that book, we really dig into this concept of climate quite deeply. But that was that was some time ago that organizations were really looking at this phenomenon of climate. And since then, since, I don't know, in the past 15 years or so, really all the talk has been about culture. And people do not, for the most part, make the distinction between climate and culture. And what's unfortunate about that, I think, is that culture really is so set in concrete. It's not that you can't change it, but people routinely underestimate how hard it is to sort of change the values of an organization. But climate, to me, is kind of the stealth. It's the stealth way to kind of come in the back door, so to speak, and maybe not change, changing the values, changing the sort of the fundamental way things get done in an organization. You may not be able to do that for quite some time, but as I say, with climate, the nice thing is that climate can change on a dime, and climate is also can be quite local. So in my team, if I work on it regularly within a team, I, as either that team leader or a team member, can rather quickly affect the climate of that team. So if we could get, all of us to think of ourselves as climate creators, then it's sort of, being the climate that we want to see, being the change we want to see, then you get this phenomenon of team climates changing quite rapidly throughout the organization. And I don't know this for sure, but I think if we did research today, we would find that helping people see that they can kind of create this climate change from the ground up, team by team, group by group, project by project, then I think that would that's sort of the backdoor ground up way to affect culture, which everybody is so interested in these days, and sort of trying to go and talk to the executives about, well, how are you going to change your company culture? I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
Yeah, thanks. Indeed, it's I don't know, is there a correlation? Do you feel like there's a correlation between climate and culture? I mean, can climate influence a shift in culture?
I think it can, because I do think that if you have enough people who understand this concept of climate and understand their power in shaping it, and if that, I mean, here's the tough part, is that power has to be acknowledged and not suppressed by the people who are at the top of the organization and who have sort of ultimate authority. And I'm sure we've all seen cases, I've certainly seen them, where you're in an organization that has a very positive climate, and then a new leader, a new boss comes in and just squashes it. It's just destroyed, basically. And that's an example of how climate, being a negative climate creator is of course also possible. Being the big wet blanket, or being the drought that comes in, that is certainly possible. But for me, I don't know of any research that really looks at sort of, how do you long-term use climate to affect culture. But I think that basically we should just stop worrying so much about culture, because it's just such a hard thing to get a handle on, whereas climate is really rather easy. And as Zhuangzi says, it's this sort of it's a matter of just kind of holding out your hand and closing it on the flower. It's just that Zen-like concept that's so simple, not easy, but very simple and very and fun.
Yeah,
a lot more fun than kind of, I don't know, having culture workshops.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Alia is smiling, and she has a question actually on the chat. Is climate more related to emotions rather than values?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think it is, because climate is, as I started out by saying, we define climate as what it feels like to work in a place. So it's just simply how does it feel? Does it feel, do I feel committed? Do I feel disinterested? Do I feel energized? Do I feel flat? Do I feel like I have influence? Do I feel like I have no power? How do I feel?
Mhm.
And how does the person sitting next to me feel? And how does that person over there feel? It's how all of us feel. So it's our collective emotions. Yeah. And
Yeah.
values are, I don't know. I mean, what research says about organizational values is that they really are very hard to change. They're often set by the founder or founders of an organization, and very difficult to change. But the emotion of just how does it feel from day to day working in this place is not hard to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, would an example be the value in the organization is autonomy, but the covert default value is that the say of the founder goes is it, and but the emotions consequent to that are feeling stifled or feeling resentful, or it's just a different matter from the values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yes, I think that is a good example, because you could have an organization that valued chain of command, that didn't particularly value autonomy, that valued hierarchy. And there are organizations like that. I mean, the military, for example, is typically values command authority greatly, and that may not be the kind of organization that we want to found or that we want to work in, but there are organizations like that that can have a very positive climate. People can feel good about working in an organization like that. The same thing with some organizations have a very strong value of innovation. Mm-hmm. Others have more of a value of being fast followers, or not even fast followers, just being very sort of conservative in how they approach their products and their customers. Sort of more of a traditional type of values. So there's different values that an organization can have, and any of those types of organizations could have a positive or a negative climate.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
As you were explaining it, Jocelyn, one thing came up for me. I was having a conversation yesterday with one of our storytellers, actually, Arosha, and she's looking into a study on well-being, right? Mm-hmm. And as you were describing it, and she was describing it yesterday, they look at well-being with 5 different dimensions. So the body, the mind, and I think meaning. And there are a couple of others. I cannot remember exactly all the different dimensions of well-being. But as you were explaining it, it seems like climate is kind of very much related to how organizations look at well-being today.
Yes.
Maybe it's just a new terminology.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point, Ria. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. There's been a lot of talk recently about well-being, research into well-being. In fact, the founder of the Forum Corporation, my former company, John Humphrey, who was very well known in the training world for many decades, he is now doing. He's joined some people at Harvard doing research on well-being. And he was the one who first initiated our climate research ages ago. So, and now he's very interested in this concept of well-being. So I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, and a company can value well-being and implement its programs in a way that make me feel stifled and way out of well-being, make me feel controlled and disgruntled and afraid, and yeah.
It's yeah, I don't know. I think that this may be heresy. I don't know in this conference.
We love heresy here.
But you know, there was so much talk about flat organizations. And I know that, you know, a Teal organization tends to be flatter than a traditional organization. But I'm just not sure that you know, the structure, this is again why I say that climate has very little to do with structure. So how the organization is structured and whether it's hierarchical or not, whether it's you know, has many layers or not, whether it's central. We spent, I can't tell you, weeks, months at my former company debating about whether we should be centralized or local, you know, central authority or local authority. And we, you know, did so many reorgs going back and forth, trying to, you know, sort of create the right structure that was going to solve everything. And I don't think that makes nearly the difference. I don't think structure makes nearly the difference that we think it does, because organizations with all kinds of structures can have a very positive climate in which people feel like they are you know, committed and contributing and energized and positive. And conversely, there can be, you know, the flattest organizations can be highly toxic, and people can, you know, really feel awful as they're working in a flat organization. So
yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's how you make it, right? And it's how you allow that space to be fertile ground.
yeah.
I think earlier there's a lot of conversation in Lisa Gill's session. We talked a bit about that, the reality that although, for example, Jos, when he talks about Teal, it feels so simple. It feels like they have achieved kind of you know, a really strong, solid foundation. But the way to get there is not easy, and that's the reality of it, right? It's not the way we are naturally wired to think about work, to think about our workplaces. And we're trying to shift that narrative in a way that is radical. So it's going to be a painful ride, a little bit of work as well. And that's what Lisa pointed out in the session as well, that it's not an easy road to traverse.
Jocelyn, I arrived late, and I'm curious whether you've identified the parameters that go into climate.
Yeah, so the 6 climate dimensions that were identified in our research a long time ago are sorry, I just want to get this right. Clarity, standards, commitment, responsibility, support, and recognition. So if you were going to, so when we did our climate assessments, for example, of organizations, we would assess them on those 6 dimensions. So what, you know, do you have clarity about what everybody's doing? Are there standards in place that people agree with? Are people committed to the mission and vision? Do people feel a sense of responsibility? Do people feel supported? Do people feel that they are recognized for their good work? So those are the 6 dimensions. But then, as I went on to say, I think now that's kind of too technocratic a way to think about climate, because it really is a much more simple, not easy, but a simpler concept.
I would be adding psychological safety and trust to the
Yeah.
list
Yeah.
of parameters.
Yeah, I think we folded those all at the time, as I recall, that was all kind of under support.
Support.
Whether you
That's what I
felt
figured.
supported. Yeah.
That's what I
Care
figured.
and
But I
support.
agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Like if I'm afraid that the local gossip, I have to watch myself very carefully because there's someone who gossips.
Yeah.
Like apprehensiveness or anxiety pervades the climate like a fog.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's no psychological safety. We usually think of psychological safety as an issue of power, but it's also little shit like whether there's
Yeah.
a office gossip.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
curious. You mentioned a bit like the impact of climate to the organization. I was able to take down two: motivation and financial returns. There was a third one. Could you a bit elaborate on what you have seen to kind of make this assessment on the impact of climate?
Yeah. There was we used to use a chart, I remember, that showed kind of a flow from climate impacts motivation, motivation impacts performance, performance impacts results, organizational results, including financial results. So it's that causal chain, but it starts with individuals' motivation. The words have changed over the years. For a while, it was engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And today, I don't know, do people talk about engagement still, or is it?
Yeah, still
Yeah.
very much so. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say 80% of organizations still rely on the ENPS or this employee engagement
Yeah.
net promoter scores. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So engagement. Yeah. But it was, this was, as I recall, one of the ahas for executives when we would talk about climate. And I think it's still something that's not well understood by executives, is that everybody's worried about sort of, are my people motivated? Are they engaged? To use today's word, employee engagement. Let's bring in the consultants to improve people's engagement. But then, as I said in that little story about Tiangong from the Zhuangzi, if you have what could be less engaging or less motivating than an executive coming up to you and saying, okay, so we're gonna manage employee engagement now. Here's your engagement survey. How engaged are you? And I always feel like, of course, as soon as you hand somebody a survey and ask them, how engaged are you? It just, I'm sure it lowers their engagement by several points at least.
Yeah, it's like the response was, if you want to effing know, you talk to me.
Exactly. Exactly. If you want to engage me, then behave in a way that so that you care. You show me that you care about what I think. Or in the case of that story about Mona, my boss, when she said, that just blew me away, that moment when I was expecting her to say, be careful with those flip charts, they're very expensive. And instead she said, be careful because they have very sharp edges, you might hurt yourself. It's like, oh, you mean you care that I might cut myself on the sharp edges? What? And my engagement just went up immensely in that moment. So, but executives usually want to, I don't know, they don't know what to do. And so they hire the expensive consultants to come in and tell them to do the engagement survey and then pay them a lot of money to tell them how to improve engagement. And yeah.
I wonder how much of the recent talk about belonging plays into that, right? The act of being seen, the act of being like appreciated, and in your 6 dimensions, it's recognition, I guess. That plays into that story of Mona and the human approach that she brought.
Yeah. Yeah. The in this book, The Art of Quiet Influence, the three big influence practices, influence being getting work done without authority. The first big practice is inviting participation. And that's another way to look at being a climate creator is are you inviting people to participate? Are you giving attention to that rather than just sort of skipping through that part? You know, when a team forms, for example, and it's like, you know, are we gonna waste time just, you know, chatting about our lives, or, you know, doing silly icebreakers? Or, well, yeah, actually you should, and research shows that you should, because that gives people a sense of belonging when they have that sense that somebody cares about them and wants them on that team, or wants them as part of that project. That it makes a tremendous difference.
Yeah, thank you so much for the links, Alia. Alia is sharing.
Yeah, I thought Jocelyn might be very interested in the nuances that Samantha Slade has identified around what is and is not an actual invitation.
Oh, great.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
That's really
a very, very nuanced article. And as to why going teal is so painful so often.
Oh, cool.
That's my my opinion on the subject.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I'll look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very interesting how such like, I mean, you said you've done this research a while back, and now they're just coming back in a different form, a different name, maybe, with a bit more complexity than ever in how it's presented and how it's felt as well. I mean, how do you feel about this reflections that we shared, and maybe this this potential like tie up with well-being? Maybe explain.
Yeah, I love that, Ria. I love that. I love the what you just sent me, Alia, the about participation and invitation, because I do find very interesting the emphasis nowadays on diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging.
Yeah.
It's often that belonging piece is often left out.
Yes.
And I think that's really that's the so what, you know. It's again that feeling of that's how people feel. That's the how do I feel like I belong? It's not,
That's,
you know,
pretty low in Maslow's hierarchy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, you know, do I feel diverse, or do I feel, and I suppose it's do I feel included? Yes, but really it's do I feel that I belong? Yeah, I think that's a very valuable thing that you've made me think about.
Yeah, I never heard that phrase included, so that's interesting. It is left out.
Yeah, I think it's starting to be on the radar as well in many organizations. Belonging, for example, at Roche, Teal at Roche are talking a lot about belonging as well. Yeah.
Is it harder in a large organization, or is it harder in a small organization?
Could be. I think you feel it. I mean, my personal opinion, it would be a different feeling of being seen and being, because in a smaller organization, it's easy to be seen. But it's also easy to kind of feel that if you have the right structures in place to be seen, right? And maybe in a larger context, you would need that structure to be able to really implement that.
There's some anthropological research, and I don't remember who did this, but that said that human beings are hardwired to be able to deal with groups of up to 150.
Oh yeah, I've read this one.
Yeah, I've heard 72, but there's a number anyway. Yeah,
there's some. I thought it was 150, but maybe it's more or less.
Could be.
But anyway, yeah, there's something that we have evolved to to thrive in, the sort of the size of a tribe, a small tribe, if you will, that is sort of hardwired into our brains. But you can, of course, in a large organization, you can have teams and teams and teams that are smaller or larger.
And microclimates too, just
Yeah.
like
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And I notice in cities, people identify with the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have names, just as if they were cities within cities. And that chunks it down a little closer to our 150.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I see we have our last 2 minutes before we reach the top of the hour. Alia, do you have any questions for Jocelyn?
No, I wish I had arrived earlier, but that is as it is. And you don't look old enough to be talking about things that happened in the 80s, but
Oh, thank you. But I am.
yeah, and I'm 82.
Wow.
So
Alia has been a force for Teal around the world, getting the book out and
Great.
really helping us, supporting us throughout this journey.
Wonderful. Well, I hope we can connect, Alia, on LinkedIn or somewhere else.
yeah, and I appreciate your research, and I appreciate what you've done. I think all of a sudden I moved to tears. It's bringing in the feminine.
Well, I'll have my next book, which I'll be talking about on Ria's podcast, is all about women and the great feminine and female archetypes and using them to lead. So connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll keep you informed.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jocelyn, for sharing this wisdom.